Thank you very much, Peter. I know it's tough in the time we have, but there will be plenty of time in question and answers. If there's more points you want to bring forward or answer, sorry. And I'm particularly interested in Peter's point about the ecosystem, which we went through yesterday, but it's not just a single area, Torchlight, but it's a wider area. Next up was Joe O'Neill. Joe is chair of the Western Drugs and Alcohol Task Force. He's also on the advisory group with myself. And over to you, Joe. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul, and thanks indeed for the opportunity to talk to you. I'm very lucky because a lot of what I was going to say follows on from what Peter was going to say and people ahead of me, so I won't repeat myself if I can avoid that. I suppose the topic that I was given about was to look at the next strategy, but I think we have to start with where we are now with the current strategy, and Jim has outlined a lot of how that was developed in 2017 with the review in 2021. And I think the key point, one of the key points I want to mention is that when the strategy was developed in 2017, there was 50 actions, each of which was assigned a lead agency or agencies who were responsible for delivering on the actions. My own experience from the task force perspective of being involved to some degree later on was that there was a review, as Jim says, in 2021, and a lot of very good changes were made to the structures, and the focus on the strategic priorities, I think, has been very, very helpful. But I think, and equally as he said, there's an oversight structure in place that meets once a quarter and it's chaired by the Minister of State. But I think the key thing is about the process and to ensure that that oversight structure is working. And we had discussions yesterday and at the previous Assembly meeting as well about the issue about the health diversion programme and why it isn't in place now. And for me, these are the issues. If you're going to hold somebody to account, this is the kind of issue that needs to be addressed. So I think it is important. And the reason I mention this at all is because this strategy is in place until 2025. It could be 18 or 24 months from today. There's a lot of good things can be done with the present strategy before we get on to the second strategy. And if we can deliver, it is a very good strategy. If it was all implemented, we'd be in a much better place than we are now. I can say that for a fact. But more importantly, in some respect, this isn't just an academic discussion about time, because this is about urgency. Every day and every hour of every day, there are people in this country suffering from drug abuse. And if you even think about, since we started here in April, over 150 people have died from drug poisoning in the country. So time is important, and I think the one thing I would say, as I say, I wasn't involved in drawing up the strategy at the time. I'm not an expert in any particular area of drugs policy. It's a very good strategy, but it has to be implemented. That's what I would say. In terms of, I suppose, what should be in the next strategy, and again, Peter has outlined a lot of what I was going to say, but I think, and as I say, I'm the chair of the task force in the West. I can't speak for all our task forces. Aubrey's situation in the Southeast would be different. But I can say one thing, that their needs are not all the same. And it's important that that's reflected in the funding and the services provided in each area. Just as you can well imagine, it's fundamentally different in the north inner city that Jim was talking about yesterday and in the west of Ireland where I am, which is such a huge area with a completely different kind of level of needs. And that has to be reflected in the service provision that's there. I would also welcome, though, engagement with the DPU, with Jim's unit, and the task forces about how best the task forces themselves can contribute to addressing the needs and delivering on the actions in the strategy. They can do a lot of, just I'd say on the part of the task forces, they're all a bit different as well. The urban task forces have a longer history than the regional ones, but they have a lot of flexibility in terms of looking at new initiatives. Planet Youth is a good example where we're involved in piloting that in the West, and so are the people here in this very area in the Dublin North East. And it's a very good way of trialling things out without having to go across a national pilot, which could cost a lot of money and become very unwieldy. So there are practical ways we can work together, and I'd very much welcome that with Jim's people and the GPU. I also think it's very important that we use a lot, as many established standards, and as I say, in guiding us in terms of identifying need and unmet needs. We did a lot of good work in the West, and I can't claim the credit for it. It happened before I got involved in doing a needs analysis, but they used a lot of the standards that were available as to what kind of service level standard should be applied. And again, it can be even something very practical, like Father McVerry was talking about yesterday, about maybe having a standard that nobody should wait for more than 4 weeks to get into treatment. And it doesn't have to be 4 weeks, it has to be whatever is practical. But these are the kind of things, and this all makes it much easier to hold people to account then. If the standard isn't met, it's very clear, you know. And as I say, you don't have to be, you can be very realistic. It might take 4 or 5 years to get to the 4 weeks, but you start off maybe with something more than that. And I think this is the kind of thing that I think it motivates people. As somebody who worked in the public service myself for over 40 years, I think it actually motivates them to have a target to aim at and to try and work towards that. It makes everything much more
Just
realistic.
2 minutes, Jim, please.
So I think that's important. I think there's been a lot of discussion. There was a question asked at the last session about the extent to which the state needs to be involved in this at all, or should it be left to the NGOs. I think my own view on this is that there's a choice really between the state either providing the services directly or enter into service level agreements with the NGOs, which will ensure that the NGOs have sufficient resources to pay their staff appropriately and to develop their services. And that's the key thing for me. The services have to be sustainable. The problem that's and you'll have seen some stuff in the media about the Section 39 organisations. The problem is that a lot of them are losing staff. They're very committed people. There's no way the NGOs should be kept out of this, because they have a lot of really committed people who are focused on their service user needs. But their good job comes up in the public service and they will go for it because they have mortgages to pay the same as everybody else. So the resourcing has to look at that. I don't have the answer to it. It could be a mix of state services and NGOs. But the key thing is that they're sustainable. I just want to finish on something slightly different. And maybe it goes back to something that was discussed earlier on about this, I suppose. The circle there, I have a belief in my head as to, you know, there's often the most interesting question is to ask why things don't happen. And a lot of that, I think, is to do with where the power and influence is in the country and the society. And also within the public service itself. And if you look at the chart, really, I think a lot of the power tends to be centralised in the middle. And I think a lot of the people that are suffering from drug addiction are well on the outside of that circle. They're out there somewhere. And I think the key point about that is that I think a lot of the people are on the margins and have remained there because their lack of influence and in terms of policy decisions. And I think there's just 2 final points I'd make.
Ask you to finish up, Jim.
I will, Paul, yeah. Just one point very quickly is that I've spoken a lot about services, but I've said nothing about changing the law. But I do think it's clear that the fact that people with drug addictions are criminalised for being addicts has had a major impact on public attitudes to drug addiction. As if, you know, and I think in that scenario, I think if possession of drugs was no longer associated with criminality, public attitudes would change and a lot of the stigma would change. Okay. It's a serious problem in the West.
Joe.
The final point I'll just say again is that I think...
I'm losing it, I'm giving up.
The key point is, last point, Paul.
We're nearly there.
The key point for me is implementation, and that will take political will. Thank you.
Well done. Well done.